Hi, and welcome to Rec Chat, where students and professionals talk about all things collegiate recreation. I am your host, Rochelle Williams from Western Washington University, where I'm the Aquatics and Youth Programs Coordinator. So, we are super excited to spotlight two members of the Asian Caucus today. But before we let them introduce themselves, we want to share our gratitude with our friends at NERSA HQ for all of their support. If you haven't already, please follow them at Twitter and Instagram at NERSA Live. So, without further ado, I will let our panelists start by introducing themselves. Earl, would you mind starting us off?
Sure. My name is Earl Cabellon. I use he, him pronouns, and I come to you from my professional home at the state of Maryland, where I work at the University of Maryland College Park as the assistant director overseeing student development and human resources. I've been a NERSA member for about over 20 years now at this point, and it's good to be back on Rec Chat. So thanks for having me, Rochelle.
Yeah, thanks so much. And Earl is one of our founding members of Rec Chat, so it's a real OG. Woo.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Alyssa. I'm the physical activity manager here at the University of British Columbia in Canada, here in Vancouver on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam peoples. My pronouns are she, her. And yeah, just excited to be here. It's my first Rec Chat, so I'm a little bit nervous, but I know I'm in good hands with Rochelle and Earl. So yeah, excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much, y'all, for being here. And this is also going to be episode 2 of this series, so make sure that you check out all of the episodes that will be live on YouTube and Instagram. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And could you all talk to us about how NERSA has supported your professional development in general, and also within celebrating your Asian identity?
Sure. So as I mentioned, I've been a NERSA member for about 20 plus years, starting as a student at the University of Rhode Island. And I think from that point, NERSA has been pivotal in my development as a professional, both personally and professionally. I've had a lot of experience in leadership roles and volunteer opportunities. I've served as a state director, both for student and professional. I've done the member network and have led Region 1. I've hosted countless numbers of state, regional, and annual professional development workshops and conferences. So yeah, I've had a lot of opportunities within NERSA, and without NERSA, I definitely would not have such an enriched career as a campus rec professional. In terms of celebrating my Asian identity, as I tell the caucus, and I think we're on maybe a year and a half, 2 years maybe, convening. I wish I had this when I was a young undergrad. I wish I had a space for other Asian students and professionals to convene and just talked about our lived experiences. And I think the pandemic has, if it's benefited me professionally in a way, it's the Asian Caucus. And, just being alongside this group of talented, students and professionals who share this commonality around being Asian. And just the learning that I've had with folks who are part of that has been so profound for me. And I'm just, so excited to see kind of where this group goes next. But yeah, I think for me, the fact that NERSA has allowed us to have this platform, for Rochelle, for your leadership and giving us this microphone to have a platform. And, it just goes to show that, in a world where diversity, equity, inclusion matters, that this organization is giving us that spotlight and that opportunity to share our stories. And so I'm definitely grateful as a NERSA longtime member, and I will always be a NERSA member moving forward. So that's my story.
Yeah, I have a very similar story to Earl. Thanks for sharing that. I, as a student, volunteered in the intramural program, as well as worked as an operations staff at our, fitness center and gym desk. And for 4 out of 5 years in my undergraduate degree, and it was in my last year where I was exposed to what's now called Nurse of Canada Regional. At the time was the Western Canadian Campus Recreation Conference, WCCRC. I think that's what we have a lot of acronyms. So I, was lucky to attend as a student leader and present there and, meet some really awesome colleagues who now I work with, which is really kind of a full circle moment. But I think that conference really provided kind of the opportunity to see, here are all the different opportunities to work in recreation. And as someone who identifies as Filipina, it wasn't, working in recreation is not a career path that most Filipinos take, at least, in the tradition, I don't know, in the sort of historical sense, it's not as common and not, something that, Filipino parents tell their kids, you should become a recreation professional. So for me, it was kind of this eye-opening experience of, wow, here are all the different opportunities. It's not just something fun that I get to do while I'm in school, but it's, here's a career path forward, and here are all the different ways. And I think for me, learning about things like graduate assistantships, those aren't super common in Canada. So to hear about those in the States and realize that, there are just so many different pathways to get to kind of a full-time role and develop that career pathway within rec, it was just a really awesome experience. And then in terms of my Asian identity, kind of stepping into the Asian Caucus, I think I remember the first meeting and all of us just sort of sharing the same experiences. And I think for me, similarly, it was okay, I'm not the only one who happened to discover this career profession and, and to be able to meet other people who have those shared experiences of, going home and having their parents not understand what they do for work, I still tell my parents, are oh yeah, you do those event things, or you do those fun race things. And I'm yeah. Right now, they really have no idea what I'm up to. They're oh yeah, she works in rec, and they're that's they tried and they bless their hearts, but it's just such a different profession. Often, kind of the stereotype too is Filipinos become nurses. My sister, avid nurse, so they understand that one, but it's just a different. It's a different career path, and they're very supportive. But yeah, it wasn't necessarily something that, they're how do you go to school for that? So I think NERSA and recreation and just kind of showing that way forward helped pave the way forward for me. So very grateful for NERSA and very grateful for our Asian Caucus to be able to be in community and share those experiences together.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. So to kind of move off of that, could you all share with us how your identity has impacted your experience and well-being formerly as a student and then currently as a professional in campus recreation?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I have a lot of thoughts, so I'll try to bottom line my thoughts. But one of the things Alyssa said, being part of the Filipino or Filipinx community, I was reminded from her story of my parents still don't know what I do. And if you follow me on TikTok, there's a video where I ask my parents what I do, and they don't know what I do. I think as I reflect on your question, Rochelle, as a student, I went to the University of Rhode Island. I grew up in Rhode Island, predominantly white. There's no one that looked like me in my town. Maybe a handful in the Boston area. We used to go visit. But I kind of assimilated to white culture, and I kind of, just blended in. And in some ways, we lived out our Filipino values by, praying together, spending mass together, family gatherings, and the importance of family, right? which actually coincides with NERSA and how, NERSA is. We use NERSA family a lot, and it really resonates with me. But, as a student, I never really thought about being Filipino. And if anything, I try to hide it, and try to just kind of blend in. I remember, just even like cuisines, right? Like, I'm going back to middle school here. So like, not bringing like traditional Filipino foods because they smell funny, and you don't get your if you don't bring your peanut butter and jelly sandwich, you're different, and so when I'm thinking back to that early age, I did really not hide, but just not showcase my Filipino roots as much as I should. Currently, as a professional, I think I started becoming more aware of my Asian identity. Particularly, it was heightened right around the time of like the murder of George Floyd. And I think that's when I started to really explore Filipino history. And Filipino history, I never knew anything about. And as I began to research and do my own internal work, I started to think about, how that impacts how I show up to work as a professional for my students. And so, I think since the pandemic, I've been really attuned to my own professional career and like looking back in my past. And I know we'll talk about this later, but just, being part of Filipino is the love that you have for people and for others. And I was always wondering like, oh, did I get passed up on stuff because I'm not, overly aggressive? Am I too passive? And some of the feedback I've received from mentors and other coaches. And so it just made me call the question, is that a problem? And is my Filipino culture lending itself and hampering me as I try to get opportunities elsewhere? So, in some ways, I reflect on it more now as a seasoned professional. But it's interesting to see kind of the spectrum of where I was, as a student to where I am now. And the Caucus even amplifies that even more and makes me more reflective, and it makes me want to help those who are in the Caucus who are younger to really explore your history and really reflect on what's there, right? And do some self-reflecting around that. So I appreciate the question. And I'm curious to see what Alyssa has in terms of that.
Yeah, there's so much to this question. Like, how do I compartmentalize my different answers? Earl, very much in the same vein of like, as a younger student trying to assimilate into, what's around me. And I distinctly remember this one moment, that harmful sort of stereotype, all Asians look the same. And I guess, one of the Caucasian girls on the team was like, on my soccer team was like, well, someone told me that, all white girls look the same. And she's like, that can't be. She's like, look at us. Like, we have so many, our hair color is different. Like, how could you mix us up, and kind of went around. And as I think I was maybe one of two Asian girls on the team at the time, she went around and said, look, we have blonde, brunette, redhead. She looks at me and she goes, black hair. And I was like, what? And, one of the girls kind of looks at this girl who's kind of sharing the sentiment and said, you realize Alyssa's Asian, right? Like, she's like, oh no, but she's one of us. And, at the time I was like, oh, I did it. I assimilated. Like I've success. Right. And, similarly, Earl, to how you're reflecting on kind of pieces of your professional career, there's a lot of my childhood that I'm still trying to uncover and reflect on and realize like, hey, wait a second, that wasn't an okay thing to say. And why did I feel really great in that moment when, it's really quite I don't know if microaggression, but it was definitely almost a bit of an erasure, right? Like a bit of like cultural erasure of kind of taking that away from me. So just in reflecting that, like there's so many pieces to that journey that I'm trying to still like figure out and uncover, and how pieces of colonialism or have impacted the Philippines, and how I've ended up here in Canada, and what does that mean as my role as a settler here in Canada on unceded lands. Like how does that all tie together? And so it's a lot to unpack. It's a lot to kind of sit and reflect on. And I am, hoping to pursue like kind of higher education around like Filipinx experiences in the broader diaspora of like what sport and physical activity experiences mean to us, and what that means to us as folks who are displaced and no longer kind of at home, so to speak, and kind of reflecting on similar experiences like I might have had on and seeing what does that mean to us, and how is that currently impacting us, and what does that mean for our future, right? So lots of pieces there, I think, and so that's where I'm kind of focusing on my professional career as well. Similar to Earl, is we obviously have lots of shared experiences, and so how do I support some of our Asian students in recognizing what that looks and feels like to them, in helping them realize maybe a career in recreation if that's something that they want to pursue, or whatever it is they want to pursue, really, and how can recreation help them get towards those goals. And just trying to again like build that community within recreation, within sport, which is predominantly not Asian. So how do we help find those places? And I think again, Asian Caucus within NERSE is great, but if you're not within NERSE, if you're not a member, how do we build those spaces outside as well? So
yeah, I want to piggyback on what you said, Alyssa, of, one thing is as Filipinx, what I'm unpacking right now, more so personally, is how anti-Black sentiment shows up in our culture, and I'll share an example is that a lot of our aunties and uncles will say things around, anti-Black stuff. And it's just so, as I reflect in my past, like how, profound it shows up. And, I didn't realize it at the time, how harmful it is. But there's some things within our culture that is really damaging. And I'm still trying to process this at the age of 42 of like, how do I have a conversation with that uncle who's being inappropriate and saying these things, right? And, what does that look like? So I just wanted to kind of add that in terms of the identity impact, how that shows up in our culture. I think the other thing professionally that resonated to me was, it's great that we have the caucus, and it's great that we have these spaces for, NERSA Asian members. But as I look at NERSA as like broader, like I've always wondered, like, hey, where's the representation in executive level positions within NERSA? And this is something that I know the caucus has explored, and I wonder if there's something there to explore, right? So professionally, I'm really, I want to be kind of helpful for the folks who kind of are part of the Asian caucus, particularly the younger members, to have a future within NERSA where they see others like a Pam Sue, like a Michael Wong, folks who are quote unquote have made it within our profession, and see more of that. And even within the NERSA board, like, the representation, I think the last person that was Asian was probably Pam Sue, I think. But these are questions that just, I wrestle with as a professional and someone who wants to pave the way and usher in more for our younger members. So I wanted just to add that. But
thank you so much both for sharing those experiences. I think it's really challenging to kind of unpack just the impact that imperialism and colonialism has had across the world, and just the like generational damage and trauma that it has created. In like I have a history degree from undergrad, and what I really studied was World War II history, and I had a whole class that was all about the Philippines and just the long-standing cycle of colonization that it endured for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and just the residual like trauma and how that has changed cultural impacts. And it's wild to think about not only just the things that have culturally that are cultural norms because of colonialism, not because of, and it's not just at home, but it's also in the workplace, where Earl, you had mentioned that you have been told that you were too passive, and you're too passive compared to what? You're too passive compared to the white supremacist structure that higher education functions in. Our standards of behavior shouldn't be a white male. And I really appreciate that y'all are willing to share your experiences, and we're hopefully within higher education there are enough of us that are starting to kind of unpack what is seen as professional and what is seen as the behavioral standard, so that way people who don't behave and act to the white Eurocentric standards, that's not seen as a bad thing, because we all shouldn't behave and act the same way, because that's not really useful, because it just perpetuates these harmful cycles for everybody. So thank you so much for sharing that. And to kind of roll into another more lived experiences, could y'all talk to us about some of your lived experiences regarding Asian stereotypes or biases that you have experienced personally or professionally? Alyssa, you talked a little bit about some stuff on your soccer team, but if y'all have anything you would be willing to share, that would be really helpful.
I can jump in on this one. So this one's an interesting one. I think I'm still trying to reflect on my experiences. I'm still fairly, you could consider young in my career. So reflecting professionally I think will still take some time. But in terms of personally, I know, so I'm what I think folks consider, I don't know if this is the right term, but a third culture kid. So I actually grew up overseas, not in the Philippines, and then moved here to Canada. So I grew up actually in Saudi Arabia. And when I moved here, I moved here around grade 8. And in our English class, one of our first assignments was teach something and present on something for 10 minutes. And so for mine, I thought, oh, what an interesting, I've come from overseas. I'm going to teach everyone how to say the numbers 1 to 10 in Arabic. So that's kind of what I had chosen. And so that was my presentation. And then, further into the term, I was getting these marks back where I was a little bit confused, because I had previously done so well in English and was starting to get these marks that I was like, I just don't understand why I'm getting these kind of lower marks in this English class. And this teacher was a little bit known for kind of pulling marks out of a hat, is what, some of the students used to say. But this teacher in particular, I finally, I was like, I'm just going to go ask her for some feedback. I just don't really understand why I'm not doing very well in English, in which, where I had to take an assessment class and an assessment test, before entering the Canadian school system, and my mark was fairly high. So like there were just so many kind of points where I was like, I just don't understand something's not adding up. So I went to her and after class and I kind of said, I'd love some feedback. I'm not really sure why I received this mark. There aren't very many kind of, marks on my paper. Like I just don't really understand. Like, can you help me understand what I can do better? And the first thing she said to me, she goes, oh, well, English is your second language, right? I was like, nope. English actually is really my only language that I could speak proficiently and understand proficiently. And she just goes, oh. I'm like, okay. And then, she kind of provided a little bit of feedback. And after that moment, my English marks went up. So it's just an interesting, like, I look at that moment and I'm like, what a stereotype in that moment to think that I have another language. I'd love to have another language, but unfortunately I don't. But just based on appearances and off of maybe one presentation where I was teaching another language that even I don't have that much background on, just, I was teaching 1 to 10 in numbers. But I think it's just, I think to that moment and think about how that could have been, that could have been, had it just been one teacher, I think probably won't make or break your academic career. But if you think about how many, and I have all the admiration for teachers. I think they deal with a lot, and especially with, with the COVID pandemic. But, whether it's in teaching, whether it's in the education system, like if we have folks who are making assumptions based off of your identity, based off of your appearance, like imagine how systemically that's going to hold so many people back in terms of pursuing higher education, where, for some universities, if you're not getting like a 99% anymore, you're not getting into a top university, right? Like the averages these days, I look at some of the students, I'm like, how are you pulling these off? I don't know if I would have gotten in back in the day, or I would have gotten in nowadays. So I think like it feels like one moment sometimes, and I just kind of brush it off. But then I sometimes think like, okay, this is one moment, but how many of these other moments are happening, and how many of these other moments are, building into bigger issues and bigger problems. So, I don't know, Earl, if you have similar or anything to share on that front.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, when I reflect back personally, as I mentioned before, growing up in Rhode Island and then going to grad school at Bowling Green State University, highly predominantly white institution, I think when I reflect back of my lived experiences, I reflect back on how I was a problem, right? And like how I was trying to almost make myself feel better by, making jokes, about Asian culture, whether it be like, I don't know, like saying like all Asians are good at math or some stereotype like that, right? And just how wrong I was in those moments, right? And I think I've been reflecting more of like how I've been the problem and perpetuated some of that stuff. And how, I want my son, who is 6 years old, to grow up in a world that he doesn't have to do that. And so I feel a little bit of shame when I reflect of, not only what has happened to me maybe, but just how I've been the problem as well, which is kind of interesting right now. I'm sure I've encountered funny looks and, been the butt of jokes. But when I think back, like they didn't really bother me as much. But now that I kind of hear and see it from other people, it stings, and it, I want to create more action around that and kind of confront and dismantle some of those harmful behaviors. So I'll say that on the personal front, that I'm still doing some self-reflection myself. I think professionally, the one instance that probably came right before the pandemic, or maybe during the pandemic, was around pay equity. And I'm not going to name the organization just because I'm not, but I was really concerned that when I was trying to find data on pay around higher ed, particularly looking at Asians, the Asian demographics of pay. And when I went up as far as I could up the chain to find like why were all these other groups cited in their reports, Latinx, Black, women, all these other demographics, but Asians were not. They were not cited. And, there was no good answer that came to me for that, but it just made me more aware of how this model minority myth of like Alyssa, like she mentioned before, of like lumping in Asians with white. Like we're so much better. We're okay, right? So we don't need to report data on. So that's just the feeling that I've gotten, and I know many people in our group have experienced that kind of stuff where we're kind of labeled with white folk as well. And the model minority myth of like, oh, Asians are fine, they're making money, they have such a high medium family income. And what I think is dangerous is that our lived experiences don't matter. So professionally, going back to what Alyssa said, how do we have conversations around our students around that? We have access to, Asian students that work for us, and how do we have conversations around that and make them more aware? So I think professionally, as I looked at my lived experience professionally and personally around stereotypes, those two kind of resonate with me. And again, I am probably in the beginning more of the exploratory journey of my identity within all of this. So I'm sure there's a lot more to unpack, but for the sake of bottom lining it, that's kind of two situations that resonate with me.
Thank you so much for sharing. And both of y'all have mentioned microaggressions a little bit in your prior pieces that you've shared. Could y'all talk to us a little bit about how you have personally navigated microaggressions? And it sounds like you've got a wide variety, like maybe within your family or maybe within the workplace, or Earl, I know you just mentioned that you're in that exploratory phase, is like as a kid, like maybe things that you did or didn't do, just kind of anything you would be willing to share around those would be really helpful.
I will say this, as someone who is looking to actively professional development, to develop myself around DE&I spaces, I have learned to try to handle microaggressions with curiosity and kindness. And I know it's an unpopular opinion, but for me, that's really tied to my Filipino roots, and for me, when I have confronted folks around that, I try to do that, have curiosity and kindness and not defensiveness and anger. And so, it's one thing to do it with family members who you have deep-rooted trust with. It's hard to do it with a colleague or a student or someone else. And I think for me, I haven't figured that out yet. But I don't think the recipe changes. I think it's curiosity and kindness. So.
Earl, I have to agree with you. Similarly, whether it's because of our roots or because of just who we are as people. But I think treating it with kindness. I think similarly, I'm reflecting on my own biases, learning and unlearning my own biases. And so, I think it's I'm trying to treat folks with the same kindness that I would hope, if I make mistakes all the time, so to treating others with the same sort of kindness and uh, that I would hope, someone would provide me in those times where we all slip up and say the wrong things or mean the wrong things, have the right intentions, but the wrong execution. So, I think kindness and grace definitely go a long way.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I think just like in my own experience, I have family members that are really old, and so I've had a lot of calling in conversations over the last decade about like, what do you mean by that? And I think that's been really helpful. So thank you so much for sharing. So as we've talked a lot about our lived experiences, and I was wondering how you've been able to kind of maybe take your own experiences, and as you're both on your journeys of like kind of self-reflection and trying to make your workplaces better for up and coming Asian students and really be there to support them. What kind of DEI actions have you been able to kind of incorporate into your workplace to kind of address or begin to dismantle kind of these systems of inequity within students and maybe the kind of broader higher ed or campus recreation community?
I can start. I like that. So I'm really lucky. So as the physical activity manager, I didn't quite explain my role. Sounds very vague, but the role is very much targeted towards getting folks moving and removing barriers to physical activity. So inherently, that's a lot of sort of DEI work, decolonizing work, working with equity-seeking groups to figure out how can we serve those folks in a better way, in a way that culturally makes sense, that's inclusive, that our spaces are inclusive and welcoming, and that they see themselves in our spaces. So a lot of that work embedded into my role. And so with that, I think some of the initiatives that we've done and actions are, we do have an inclusive rec committee, and now like a larger department with athletics as well. Inclusive committee for that as well. Targeted to dismantling those systems of inequities across the department. So that's really great. In terms of some specific programming, we do have some programs specific to Asian students on campus, BIPOC students, Black, Indigenous, people of color students on campus. Indigenous programs that we work with are Indigenous sort of student center that are specific for Indigenous students or Indigenous staff and faculty as well. And I think those programs are really great because, similar to the Asian Caucus, like bringing those folks together where they can share an experience and share in those similar cultures together and experience physical activity program for the first time, or maybe for a number of times. So I think those are like some specific actions. I think for myself in reflecting and unlearning is really taking that sort of intersectional lens throughout all my work. So even if it is just a fitness class or just a sports game, taking that lens, whether it's anti-racism, ableist, or there's one other one I was just thinking of, even when we were thinking about body image or climate action, like all those pieces are so inherently tied to Rochelle, the white supremacist systems that our education and our society is so built on. So I think really in anything that we do, always taking that lens or those various intersectional lenses into our work and considering how various groups might be impacted by a program that traditionally seemed like a very normal thing, and a very low barrier and easy thing to do, but actually might, be ableist or be discriminatory for however other many reasons. So
that's all great stuff. I love it. So really quick, there's 3 things that I will say that we are doing actively within our department. The first one is called the Terrapin Strong program, and this is actually an initiative from our president. It's an onboarding program for all faculty staff, and it's centered around identity and creating action around how to dismantle white supremacy culture and be actively anti-racist. And so what that has done for me is to kind of piggyback off that program. And so we are in the process of scaffolding some building blocks off the Terrapin Strong program and embedding that into our onboarding program. So when we hire new students, you not only are you going to learn about, your own identity, but action, but you're going to learn about some of the mistakes that recreation has made in that as a whole, whether it's ableism, and all that stuff. So students who are coming into our organization, one of the first things they're going to learn is that. So I'm excited to roll that out. Some of my talented colleagues have created this program called Anti-Racism is Wellness. Quick plug, that'll be one of the presentations at the NERSA conference, so definitely check it out. But it's a good framework to embed 2, huge big buckets that are part of our the fabric of what we do within collegiate rec. And it has to do with just education around anti-racism and the connection to well-being. And then finally, for me, Rochelle knows this, I've been on a personal journey around coaching. And I think it's enabled me to learn how to listen, how to actively listen, and also to ask really powerful questions. And I'm on this crusade to see what's there for our profession. And for me, personal development coaching is something that I have benefited from. And so I'm excited to explore and learn more about coaching and how we as campus rec professionals need to be coaches and how we interact. And maybe that will inherently dismantle some of the DE&I stuff that we're facing. And if we do more listening, we can hopefully do more action. And so I think it's time for us to get out of our own head and start listening. So those are just 3 things around dismantling systems of inequities that I'm working on.
Thank you all so much for sharing. And then to wrap it up, I would love to give you all some time to maybe talk about or recognize any mentors that have supported you in your personal or professional journey. If you've got anyone you'd like to shout out, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I'd love to shout out my director. He's been directly my boss since I was a student. I'm very lucky that I have a director and a sort of senior manager and director that are both Asian. So to see that identity and that role modeling and mentorship has been very integral. But I also know I'm very lucky to have that, and that's not the case in a lot of rec institutions across.
Yeah, I mean, did I lose someone? Okay, you guys cut out for a second. Anyways, so I guess for me, just people that come to mind, Bill Crockett definitely has been kind of my kind of confidant, my sponsor, Jocelyn Hill, Kevin Marbury, Jorge Herrera, my colleague, And even you, Rochelle, I think I've learned a lot from you and our relationship professionally with RecChat and being in Region 1. I've always appreciated that. But, those 4 or 5 people come to mind when I think about people who care deeply about me and my well-being and my growth. And doesn't have to be, my mentors don't have to be people that have been in the field for a while. They're people who are just next to us around the journey. So appreciate you being in this space, Rochelle, but to the others that I wanted to recognize. So
thanks. So we're going to end by making me cry. So I think it's been a while since I've cried on something that's been recorded. So thank you, Earl. That means a lot. Good. I'm going to get my life together. Maybe. But yeah, thank you all so much. I really deeply appreciate you all being willing to not only be such an active part of the Asian Caucus and really providing support for the incoming generation and really being willing to explore your own personal identity and then also share that with all of us. It's really, really helpful for our NERSA family to have a broader understanding of everybody in our family, and I really appreciate you all being a part of that. So thank you so much. Deeply appreciate it. Thanks for everybody for coming to the broadcast today, and please check in for the episodes 1 all the way through 5. And thanks everybody, and have a great day.